Hello, welcome back to the Arturia Pigments tutorial series. Today we're going to start having our first look at the oscillators. This is basically the heart of the synthesizer, the thing that makes sound. Now I think the simplest of all the oscillator types to describe is the analog engine, and that's where we're going to start first. But of course our default preset out of the box has a wavetable in it, so we need to choose analog instead. And now I'm going to play a note. And there's a sawtooth. I've got the volume set nice and low so that it's not too brash. The reason why sawtooths are so brash is because they contain so many harmonics. In the insight window below, you get to see all of these little lines are individual harmonics or sine waves, and sawtooths have a very high content of harmonics, which is why they're so good for subtractive synthesis, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. I don't want to dwell on it too much for now, but that's what you're hearing a sawtooth. The sawtooth that you're hearing is coming out of oscillator 1. It's the only one that's turned up. We actually have 3 oscillators available to us, but the other 2 are currently turned down. So while we're just dealing with oscillator 1, let's have a look at some of the options available to us. You can see that we've currently got a sawtooth, but we have 5 different fundamental shapes available, and these are almost universally consistent throughout every analog synthesizer. It's entirely possible you've seen these in many synthesizers over the years, but the oscilloscope is going to prove to you these genuinely are the shapes. So this oscilloscope is external to Pigments. All it's doing is seeing the wave that this synthesizer is outputting, and it's showing you a picture of it, and you can see that the images are genuinely faithful replications of the waves itself. Square waves, you always get a slightly unusual shape. Depending on how the square wave is generated, you get this kind of very slightly offset, but that is a square wave. Okay, so those are the 5 different types, and they all sound radically different. Sine wave is obviously the smoothest because it only has a single harmonic. If you have a look in insight below, just one harmonic at the fundamental frequency. And because I'm playing a C, it's going to be around about 130 Hz. Let's have a look at some of these options underneath the main title. Firstly, we've got coarse. So this is an individual tuning just for this oscillator. So each of these 3 oscillators, when we get them all going, we'll be able to have different tunings between them. But the coarse knob, and as you can see, it's highlighted 0 semitones, tunes the oscillators in steps of semitones. Let's turn this up a bit. In fact, we'll switch back to a sawtooth. You can hear it stepping up in what's called quantized steps every semitone. Just to the left of that control, we've got this symbol called FM, and it's highlighted, which means it's currently on. And this stands for frequency modulation. And a little bit unfortunate to encounter such a complex subject right out of the gate, but here it is. So let's just deal with it head on. This is frequency modulation is the concept of changing the pitch of this oscillator using another oscillator. And the oscillator that we're going to use to perform this pitch variance is actually oscillator 3, bizarrely. And the reason for that is this little section over here. This is our modulation section, and at the moment it says that oscillator 3 is the source of the modulation. So what's going to happen is that this oscillator, when I turn the amount up, is going to change the pitch very, very quickly, very rapidly, because oscillator 3 is a pitched oscillator where we can hear this thing, and it's going to wreak absolute havoc on oscillator 1. Let's do it. And immediately we see a completely corrupted wave. Now, frequency modulation, as I say, is a pretty advanced subject, and I don't want to go too far into it this early on in the tutorial. Suffice to say that to have a baked-in FM modulator at the oscillator level is pretty unusual, and it's one of the features of Pigments. Almost every aspect of it is exceptionally rich, exceptionally detailed, and immediately capable of performing like outrageous sounds. And so, having had this very small example of what FM sounds like, we're going to carefully step away from it and not do that again for a while. What we're going to do now is bring oscillator 2 into the picture. If I turn the volume of oscillator 2 up and we watch the shape in Insight, you'll see it change from a sawtooth, just turn the volume down, to something other. And both of these oscillators are generating sawtooths. Watch what happens when I bring the volume in. See these ripples beginning to appear. And eventually they get really pretty dramatic. Now the reason we're hearing this comb filtering, and it's actually a strobing comb filter known as unison detune, the reason why you're hearing this weird filtering sound is because these two oscillators aren't actually generating the same pitch of sound. It looks to all intents and purposes like they are. Both of their coarse knobs are set to 0 semitones. They're both generating sawtooth waves. This is a digital synthesizer, so it's going to be very accurate in what it does. So why have we got this very slight detune between the two pitches? The answer is over in our tuning section. We have 0.01 value of drift, and this emulates old analog synthesizers where they weren't in the digital domain and oscillators weren't perfectly synchronized together, and so there was this very, very slight detuning between the oscillators, which actually gives you a really rich and interesting sound. It's a nice sound, and so they've emulated it with the drift knob. If I turn drift all the way down, just that tiny amount has all the difference, and now the wave will be completely static. What you're hearing there is two sawtooths added together perfectly in sync. And what you get when you add two waves together that are identical is a wave twice the volume of the original. We can prove that very easily. Let's have a look at the volume of the lowest frequency on this wave. Minus 18.5. There we go, minus 18.5. So if I take one of these oscillators away, the volume of the fundamental frequency is now going to be minus 24.5. Does it say minus 24.6? Close enough. So that's a doubling of volume. Now we're only getting that effect because the waves are literally identical. If we generate any kind of difference between them at all, then we'll lose a substantial part of that effect. If I make the second one a triangle wave, then we're going to be at just a different volume. It'll be slightly louder than the minus 24.5 that we had originally. Minus 20.4, just a unique combination between those two waves, and we can see that in the oscilloscope. That's what it looks like when you add a sawtooth to a triangle wave, this weird kind of angular shape. So we've established that these are just oscillators that are being added together, both generating sound simultaneously, but fundamentally they're doing the same job. Now oscillator 2 has this fine tune, and that's another way that we can introduce this concept of drift. If those two oscillators are very slightly out of tune with each other, then we're going to get, again, a more interesting and colourful sound. Let's do that. Head back to a sawtooth, still got our drift at 0. So we'll start off with our nice simple static wave, and then a very small amount of detune, and there is our strobing comb filter. I can double click on this fine tune control to set it back to 0, and that's true with any Arturia value. And what the default is when you get to double click, sometimes it's in the middle of a control and sometimes it's 0. It really depends on the control itself. So here it's setting to 0 when I double click it, but over on the volume knob it's setting it to maximum when I double click it. The next thing that we can see on oscillator 2 is that we've got this key setting. That's the thing that allows the oscillator to track with your keyboard. I'm just going to turn oscillator 1 down. So we're just hearing oscillator 2 there. I'll take it out of key mode and play exactly the same 5 notes again. All of these notes are C3. Lowest note on my keyboard, highest notes on my keyboard. One good example of using a static droning tone is if you want to emulate bagpipes, because they have that constant hum in the background with the pitched melody over the top. Just one small example. But generally speaking, oscillators will have their key mode engaged. So we've nearly dealt with everything in this square of our core analog engines. There's just one feature that we haven't talked about today, and so we'll cover it now, even though it needs you to be a little bit brave. We're going to have a look at the sync setting. So this is a bit mind-bending. What happens when we turn sync on is that oscillator 2 becomes a slave to oscillator 1. In other words, it's no longer in control of its own pitch. So at the moment, we're listening to oscillator 2, and it's the only oscillator we can hear. Okay? So I'm going to press a note on my keyboard and hold it down. And now I'm going to change my coarse tuning. We don't go up or down in pitch. The pitch of oscillator 2 is now being controlled by oscillator 1. So I'll hold my C down again and prove that. The reason why sync exists is because it allows you to generate a sound that can't be generated via any other form of synthesis. What we get here is the ability to offset these two oscillators in pitch, in other words, have them generate different pitches. But because oscillator 2 has its fundamental pitch locked to oscillator 1, oscillator 1 is the master, oscillator 2 is the slave, you get really interesting shapes. If I do it in the oscilloscope, you'll see that the shape of hard sync bears no resemblance to any other kind of processing that you can apply. This little notch in the curve is what's happening with sync. And the reason is that oscillator 2 is now cycling faster than oscillator 1. It's going to be at whatever 130 hertz plus 2 semitones, 150 odd or whatever it is, faster. That's the important thing. 130 times a second, oscillator 1 says to oscillator 2, forget what you're doing, start drawing your shape again. And so oscillator 2 dutifully complies and starts drawing its shape again from the very top of this sawtooth. Gets all the way down, comes back again, starts drawing its second wave, and at this point here, oscillator 1 comes along and says, whoa, 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 stop what you're doing, start drawing again, and it just keeps on doing that. 130 times a second, oscillator 1 is interrupting oscillator 2 and saying, stop what you're doing, start again. And so as we increase the pitch, the coarse tuning, you'll see this second line get longer and longer. Let's see that. And the reason why we don't hear a change in pitch when we change the coarse knob on oscillator 2 is because oscillator 1 is doing something 130 times a second. That's the very definition of pitched sound. This repeating, predictable pattern occurring a certain number of times a second, 130 in this case, is going to generate that as your pitch. And then what happens inside the wave is just colour. So we hear a different tone. And so the sync option in oscillators is used, this is called hard sync, and it's used to produce a really brash, harsh sound because there are so many unusual and unexpected harmonics in the wave. This really metallic, kind of angry sound. But I think that's a good place to stop. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, it helps me out with YouTube stuff. And hopefully I'll see you for the next one when we'll carry on having a look at the oscillators. Thanks very much for watching.